I'm here with Bengt Northstream of Northstream to introduce and discuss Northstream's predictions for 2013. Northstream has an annual tradition of doing predictions for the coming year. Bengt, 2012 has been characterized by fast industry change, and 2013 proves to be no exception to that. If we look back, the mobile industry is characterized by fast and continuous change. And one observation that you have made is that the profitability balance of the industry is changing. More and more of the profits are generated by the mobile device manufacturers. And you predict that this change in profitability balance will now impact the evolution of R&D in the industry. We see, for example, that mobile infrastructure vendors today generate just 1% of the profits of the industry, whereas the device manufacturers, they generate more than 10%. In what way does this impact the mobile industry, and how do you predict that R&D will change?
Well, it's quite a dramatic change. If we look back 8 years, handset vendors have gone up to represent 11% of total telecom revenues. And the interesting thing with that is that they represent, that's essentially Apple and Samsung, two players. And if we look at Apple alone, iPhone and iPad sales in third quarter of this year is at the same level as the whole mobile infrastructure sales. So that's where we have arrived. And we say this will have a huge impact on where innovation and R&D will come from in our industry. And we also say this because we think that you almost take for granted that there will always be innovation and development of standards. But when we say that, we have to remember that has originally come from close cooperation between vendors and operators. Later, it has basically been only vendors that has been contributing on the infrastructure side, but now we come to a point where they are under margin pressure, all of them, and they are cutting back in cost and in headcount, and we think that it will be increasingly influenced by particularly Apple and Samsung. And what is interesting with that is that they don't have the same incentives and drivers as the infrastructure vendors and operators have. The operators, they like open standards, they like competition between infrastructure vendors and handset vendors. Infrastructure vendors have the same interest, particularly for competition between them, and also that the handset sector should be competitive. But now, when you have two dominant handset vendors, they have less of that incentive. Their key interest is to standardize and develop something that is supporting their vertical integration, and that's how they are approaching the market.
But is that necessarily wrong? Isn't the handset manufacturer the consumer's best friend?
Short term, I mean, first of all, both Samsung and Apple has been tremendously important for building devices and services that customers really love, and the strong growth we've been having in mobile broadband is to a large extent created by Apple and Samsung. But if you look at what they are doing right now, if you take the evolution of SIM card, if you take how they look at Wi-Fi, if you look at the latest news that has come out that Apple is actually requiring testing of operators' network before they allow operators to use iPhone 5 for LTE. You're creating a system where the standard is led by two dominating players, and ultimately that will probably lead to a less competitive market, and I think that will be negative for the development of the industry.
So just so that I understand you correctly, in the short term, the operators are then prevented from offering what is actually their core service, high-speed data, to a certain segment of their own user base.
Yeah, and that's the risk they are running. And I think that you come to a situation, if you look at the operator and vendor community today, they are all looking at cost cutting. To cut R&D and development cost is an easy thing to do, because it will only impact not the next, but the CTO or CEO after that. So it's quite easy to cut on R&D because it doesn't immediately impact your business. But if you look at the long-term impact of this, I think operators and infrastructure vendors are very vulnerable in this development. And we basically say that 2013 is a good test year, or possibly a turning point where operators and vendors probably have to step up and make sure that we have a continued development of open standards. If not, someone else is quite happy to take over, but on their premises.
Very interesting. But do you see it's likely that this counter response, will it be the large operators and the number 1 and 2s in the vendor space, or is there an opening for other entities such as regulators or industry bodies to take initiatives in the R&D and standardization space?
Well, I mean, industry bodies are financed by vendors and operators. So again, when we make this revenue split, we talk about 11% for handset vendors, 1% for infrastructure vendors, the rest is mobile operators. So it's just that they have left the standardization and R&D work essentially to the vendor community for the last 15 years or so. But maybe this is more an alarm call for us. Wishful thinking is very hard to change the current trend. But if we like to secure open standards going forward, I think it's time for the vendors and operators to think about how should they look at the future, and who should really dominate and lead this industry forward.
Let's move on to prediction number 2. And that is somewhat related to the operator challenges. You predict that regulators now will allow increased operator consolidation, partly to save LTE in Europe. When we look back, the operators represent an industry sector where revenues have been pretty much flat during the last years. Revenues among European operators today are the same as they were in 2005. They are struggling with this in different ways. Price wars has been one phenomenon, but another major tool has been network sharing. However, network sharing has been hampered by different regulatory regimes in the European markets. As I understand it, there is a need among operators to do more network sharing or consolidate in a different way than we have seen. And you believe, or you predict, that what we now will see is that regulators in Europe realize this.
We hope so, at least. I mean, if you look at all the work we do in the industry, helping operators to analyze business cases for launching LTE services, we notice one thing very clearly, and that is to make a business case 5-7 years ago for launching a new operator based on voice and text revenues was possible. If you try to do the same exercise today based on mobile broadband and LTE, it's quite a different game. The bar has been raised, so to speak. The transmission cost because of fiber is more expensive, subsidies are higher, customer care is more expensive, national roaming agreements based on data are not as favorable perhaps as text and voice was previously. So this is a different market than it was 5-7 years ago. And increasingly we see how these smaller players are struggling. If you look at spectrum auctions, for instance, they are normally favoring the incumbents or the bigger players, so they can always grab more spectrum than the smaller players can. And overall, when we talk to investors and to operators, there is an increasing realization or awareness that we have to consolidate. To have this idea of that there should be 4 or 5 operators per market doesn't hold up very well any longer. So there is an awareness there, the market should consolidate. The only resistance you have here is from regulators and competition authorities. And they are sort of turning a blind eye to this. They like to have 4 or more players markets because it's good for competition. And they forget that the smaller player will almost always be a bad investment for the investors, and they will never get their money back.
It's an interesting phenomenon that 5 or 10 years ago we had almost a discussion about a law of nature, that every market can sustain a four-operator situation. And what we are witnessing now is basically that in most markets the answer is no.
Exactly. And then we say that in 2013, the pressure and increasing awareness of the realities of operating a network will surface and will be clear even to regulators and competition authorities. And we think that they increasingly will allow consolidation. We're not saying that this will happen in one go. We're just saying that they have to be more friendly and open-minded to when the market players in a particular market like to consolidate, they should allow that to happen to secure the long-term investment and sort of healthiness of the competitive environment in any given market. I think one thing we emphasize here, you can look at the US market, which is a competitive market, but it has the consolidation has come further than it has in the rest of the world. And you have two dominant big players, Verizon and AT&T, who are the most sort of aggressive LTE proponents in the world today. And they also have the biggest number of customers if you look globally. We say that that's largely created by that they have the stability in their business, that in reality there are two players, and the US customers are paying a bit more for mobile broadband than we do in this part of the world. But the advantage is that they have continuous strong investments in networks, which we don't have in Europe. And we're saying that if regulators are not allowing this to happen in Europe, we will continue to fall behind in LTE, which would be a sad thing, really.
Is there a connection here between the availability of LTE bands as well?
I think that played a role initially. So that gave the US and Korea and Japan a head start. But if we look at today, I mean, we have the spectrum. We have 800, we have 2600, in some markets 900, 1800 megahertz can be used for LTE. So now it's more a matter about the ability, the confidence to dare to invest in networks, which you don't see in Europe today.
Let's move on to prediction number 3, and that is actually also LTE related. You predict that the small cell debate will be ended by the LTE rollout. The small cell debate we can call a rehashed version of the old ideas of small cells based on GSM or DECT or other technologies. There has been various attempts throughout the history of the mobile industry arguing for a business case for small cell solutions. But you actually predict now that LTE reduces the need for small cells. Can you explain this?
Sure. I think this goes back to the big femto cell era you had a few years ago. It was big in the US and a few vendors were getting behind it. Cisco was one of them. Some of the bigger operators there really put very hard requirements on the traditional telco vendors to have femto-cell products in their portfolio. We never really understood that because we know for certain that the actual cost for a femto-cell, for instance, could be low enough. But we have always been worried about the operational cost of it, the deployment cost, the support cost, transmission cost. And we think that is what is killing the small cell market. So when that later sort of has evolved into a small cell hype, with small cell forums, with conferences, with a lot of venture money behind the small cell product companies, we're getting back to basics and saying, let's look at the situation here. With LTE, we are again using lower band spectrums. We're using 700 in the US, we're using 800 and 900 in this part of the world. And if you put your new LTE base stations on your existing GSM and 3G grid, you get the best indoor coverage we have ever had in the industry. You can go back to GSM even. And we say with that, that's the frame, that's sort of the groundwork for having good indoor coverage in LTE. In addition to that, there will of course be a need for smaller cell products. And then we're saying that that will probably only be Wi-Fi. The Wi-Fi ecosystem has evolved tremendously over the last 10 years. I think many of us, including myself, ignored that 10 years ago. But when we look at it today, if you look at the money behind it, the strong companies behind it, and the strong roadmap behind Wi-Fi, we're saying that between the traditional products from the bigger vendors, now macrocell and microcell products, between that and Wi-Fi, there is a very, very small cell market. It's nothing to write home about, basically.
But there is an OpEx implication here also. Operators are actually making use of the fact that consumers now are used to accessing Wi-Fi on their own, and thus the consumer behavior actually reduces OpEx need on the operator.
And that's a very important point you're bringing up. In any given indoor coverage requirement situation you have, I mean, you can take this company. If we like to have indoor coverage provided by an operator, I can try to call an operator and convince them to install a base station here, but the likelihood for that happening is very low. The alternative is that I go to the nearest retail shop, which is probably 100 meters from here, and I can buy a Wi-Fi router, and I can have instantly indoor coverage. And when you look at the increasing sort of collaboration between the traditional cellular products and the vendors behind it and Wi-Fi, the interoperability is becoming better. You can already today in the most advanced phones automatically switch from your cellular network service to a Wi-Fi, and you can be authenticated and everything. So it's already happening basically, and it's probably good news because it gives the market a choice. Either the user or the enterprise buy the Wi-Fi products and install them by themselves and take the cost for that, or it can also be Wi-Fi provided services by the operators.
Exactly, and this is an area where I think we have seen ambivalence among the operators. On the one hand, acquisition of Wi-Fi assets and to a certain degree rollout of Wi-Fi assets, but actually a mixed track record when it comes to the integration of the Wi-Fi offering with the, let's call it the LTE or mobile broadband offering.
Absolutely, and maybe it has been a bit ahead of the market. I think now the technology is better, the interoperability is better, so it's easier for operators to realize this than it has been in the past.
Let's move on to prediction number 4 then, which is managed services are dead, long live managed services. That's a difficult one to understand, and I'm sure you will give a good explanation. Managed services is one of the growth sectors among the vendors in recent years. It has actually grown spectacularly in relative terms if we look on a 5-10 year perspective, and it's been a strong growth sector. Now, however, we are watching, and you have observed that a number of even the major managed services providers, you have examples such as NSN and Alcatel-Lucent, are retreating a bit from this market. Can you describe the phenomenon and the following prediction for 2013?
Sure. First of all, you have had a decline in revenues from equipment sales in the mobile infrastructure sector, and that's caused by the tough competition we have had for the last 10 years with the entry of Chinese vendors. So equipment revenues has been falling. To compensate for that, all these vendors have moved into services. So if you look at the biggest vendor today, Ericsson, roughly 50% of their revenues comes from services. So that has been a trend across the industry. A particular segment of that then is managed services, which is, for Ericsson's sake, probably around 10% of their revenues today. What we note here is that it has been for the sake of growing revenues, it has been for the sake of that services looks, as an interesting and good revenue source. But when we analyze this harder, we note that none of the vendors are sharing their margins on managed services, and we think they don't do that for a good reason. If we look at why hasn't it been a great business for the vendors, we think it's because it has been made too simple. You have sort of largely you have tried to solve headcount issues that operators have been having. Vendors have inherited organizations as they are, and try to get scale and efficiency from that. And our point here is that you can make the comparison with the airline industry. If you are in this part of the world, there's been a lot of discussion about SAS, the airline company here. And one of their competitors said, then when they had their big crisis a month ago, that even if they cut salaries to zero, their cost per seat would still be higher than the low-cost airline companies of today. And the reason for that is that they have an old airline fleet with high maintenance cost and high fuel costs. And that's a very interesting comparison if you take it to the operator community, because they are in the same situation in many instances. They have old services, they have circuit switched equipment, they have old processes, and that's normally what the vendors have been inheriting. So it has been difficult for them to scale it, but it has also come back to the operators because of the limited scaling opportunity for the vendor. That means that the price decline for the operator is not that high either. And we're saying here that this has to come to an end, and I think all players are realizing that, and you made a comment about NSN and Alcatel-Lucent here. So we think that there is still a big business opportunity in managed services, but it has to be made on other premises, addressing the real big cost drivers at the operators, doing transformation activities before you outsource. So there's much more homework to be done if managed services is going to be successful, which we think it can be, but it has to be on different premises than today.
Yeah, and I guess there's a lot of homework actually on the vendor side also. In spite of all the experience they have established, the original thoughts about a blueprint worked better in a situation where network operations were more about coverage and a couple of radio technologies. Now we are facing a very, very complex radio situation and demands for high-speed data in very varying topographies in different countries. And then the scaling opportunity becomes more challenging, and obviously a blueprint doesn't exist that fits all countries.
Exactly, and I mean in some instances the sort of blueprint version where with big scaling opportunity like for network operation centers, that works fine. But for the rest of managed service opportunities, they have to be addressed with much more homework from both the vendor and the operator before being successful. And a lot of that has to do with actually addressing the real legacy cost you have in equipment, processes, systems, and services you provide to customers. The situation, as we know it from work with our customers, is that it's much easier to get approval for buying a new platform, offering a new service to customers, rather than taking care of your legacy cost where your real problems are.
It's usually more fun.
It's also more fun. It's very human to react like that.
Let's move on to the fifth and large prediction, which is very exciting and challenging, I think, for the operators and the mobile industry to understand and accept, which is that Microsoft will take the lead for new generation operators. This is surely an exciting one. Microsoft has been for enterprises the go-to destination for office software and certain work solutions. Recently, we have seen enterprises not just going to the operators for their communication needs, but also to alternative voice over IP providers such as Skype. So that today's office environment are characterized by a whole range of solutions. Microsoft is actually a player that for a number of years has had a number of tools that they could tie together in a unified communication solutions, and that they now are ramping up their efforts in the so-called unified communications space. Can you describe these observations? Sure. and the prediction?
Just like you say, the trend we have been witnessing for a long period of time. We have seen the arrival of Viber, of Skype, of WhatsApp, and we have, particularly in 2012, seen how these actually are taking revenues from the operators. Customers move to these non-cost providers of voice and text and chat services. So that trend we have seen already for a long time. When you take a player like Microsoft, they are a true global player. They are present in basically every office where there is a computer in the world. So that is cemented. They have the best partner network in the industry. 640,000 such entities are supporting Microsoft in sales to enterprises globally. So when you take, from what we know from WhatsApp and Skype and others, and then connect that with a global player with presence in every office, with one brand and one communications offering to enterprises, that becomes a very powerful force, we predict. And the trends are becoming clearer now. We see in many parts of the world operators are already partnering with Microsoft, and that has made those operators quite successful in selling to enterprises. And going forward, we say that you have a similar development. Microsoft is what WhatsApp and Skype has been for consumers, but much more powerful. And the separation of IP of services and connectivity will probably make the operators, even in the enterprise space, more of a connectivity provider. You go to your operator and you can decide whether you like to have a 10 megabit or a 100 megabit service. You can discuss what kind of security and redundancy solution you like to have, how many servers should be installed and backed up, and how many times you can, for what cost you should get support and so forth. But for the actual communication service, text and voice and collaboration and everything else, we think that will be delivered by companies like Microsoft.
But I guess among those 640,000 partners, a couple of hundred are operators who have actually tried to do partner offerings with Microsoft. I guess they face a choice here.
They definitely face the choice, and I think many of them will, as operators normally do, try to say that we can do something better ourselves. Our prediction here is that no, that won't work. It's probably better to think of Microsoft as a partner, probably think in terms of creating alternatives to Microsoft, so there are more partners to select from, but that operators with their own services should be able to compete with Microsoft and others is far-fetched from us. So we think the partnership model is much more likely than anything else. And can I just add one thing here, which I think is striking when we have worked in this sector for some time, and that is the mentality and the culture of how operators do business compared with how Microsoft does business, or any kind of online internet-based company. When enterprises, including Northstream, is buying a service from an operator, we do that under an SLA. We expect guaranteed services of some form, which means that for every time an operator sells something to an enterprise, there is a negotiation. There is a lengthy phase of agreeing on terms and conditions for being a user. When you're a Microsoft user, your only choice is to say, yes, I agree, or I don't agree. There is no negotiation part in the relation with a Microsoft. So the cost of sales for Microsoft on a global level is much lower than it is for an operator. And that is in the minds of the customer themselves, how they view different providers of services.
So this also implies a demand for a cultural transformation among the operators who actually want to partner with Microsoft. Is it fair to say that we will see a swifter movement, higher adaptability among the number 3 and 4 operators in each market than maybe the bigger ones?
I think that will take some time. It's so embedded in our way of thinking. We have the same situation with data privacy. When we are Facebook users, we're happily keying in all the data you can ever imagine on where we are and who we like and who our friends are and everything else. When it comes to requirements on operators, we are under strict law of what they can do, and to change that mentality, I think, takes a long time. I don't think it will happen in the nearest time frame at least.
So it's both on the end user side and the operator side. It continues to be difficult to be an operator. That's my conclusion.
Well, saying all that, I think the network is probably a more important asset than ever. I think operators are fine. They have a cost issue to address. They have a a partnership situation to address. But overall, they are there with being the connection for the customer to internet and all the services, and that's still a very valuable part to provide to the enterprises and to the users.
Thank you, Bengt. That concludes the 2013 predictions from Northstream. I'm sure we're all excited to meet back again in a year and follow up what happened and what will happen in 2014.